So how does Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 run on a 4790K? Let's find out. So first, the specs of my machine. I'm running a 4790K with 32 gigs of 1666 megahertz RAM. We have a 6800 non-XT AMD reference card. We are running on 2 SSDs and we have Windows 10 Pro installed. Now, I ran a 1080p benchmark at a location that I died quite often. And we're running it from the canned low, medium, high, and finally ultra setting. The game is set to native resolution, which means that it is not going to be running FSR. Let's get into it. First up, the low setting. The highest FPS we are seeing is right at the beginning where it briefly went over 60 FPS. The moment the enemies appear on screen, we quickly dip below that number and stay there throughout. The CPU was taxed between the upper 80s and saw 92% at the top end. The GPU sat mostly at the 50s and 60s with a peak at 73%. At the end of the run, the lowest FPS recorded was 48, with an average FPS of 53 and a 1% low of 41. On a medium setting, we again flirt with 60 at the start, but then quickly go down. The CPU is stacked in the upper 80s once again, but more frequently hits the 90s. Top value was 95% on the CPU. The GPU is now operating mostly in the 60% load category with a peak load of 79% recorded. At the end of the run, the lowest FPS recorded was 47 with an average FPS of 52 and a 1% low of 40. On the high setting, we no longer see 60 FPS in the beginning. The CPU is running very similar to the medium setting with a similar peak of 95%. The GPU is taxed a little bit more and added about 200 megs of RAM usage compared to the previous two runs. Top load was 83% during this run. At the end, the lowest FPS recorded was 46, with an average FPS of 51 and a 1% low of 40. On ultra setting, the game gets nowhere close to 60 even at the start. The CPU is taxed more and we end up seeing a peak of 98% during this run. The GPU sees some more utilization as well, ending up showing a top load of 85% during this run. At the end, the lowest FPS recorded was 41, with an average FPS of 50 and a 1% low of 37. If you enjoyed this type of content, please consider subscribing. I enjoy doing it, and of course, leave me a comment down below if it affected your decision to buy this game or not. Now, it is definitely true that this game is CPU dependent in case of my system. The CPU is definitely taxed while the GPU is coasting along. Now, this section here is not at all indicative of what happens later on in the game where stuff opens up. And I continued to play in Ultra and did some more testing, and here is that result. We quickly find out that Space Marine 2 is going to take way bigger chunks out of the 4790K. In this section, the processor is running 90% utilization and the FPS is tanking in the 30s routinely. But we are not done yet. In this section later in the game, we see the processor pegged at 100% and FPS dumping in the mid to high 20s at times. The entire game doesn't consist of wide open spaces with hundreds of enemies though. There are sections indoor where the processor is giving time to breathe, although there's still a point where 100% utilization dumps the FPS very briefly. Throughout this section, the game runs mostly in the 40 to 50 FPS range very smoothly. Going back outside with swarming enemies, the FPS dumps back down in the 30s. But the game also has outside locales where it acts more like the indoor section showed earlier. Less enemies means the processor has time to render the frames and the game runs smooth at 40 to 50 FPS. So conclusion here, if you're expecting 60 FPS on Ultra at 1080p with a 4790K, at least with my setup, it is just not going to happen. Maybe if you put FSR on, but I didn't want to test that. I wanted to tax my system as hard as possible. Now you also have to remember is that I am recording on this rig, which means that I am taxing the processor that's already below spec even more. So without it, I do see a couple more FPS during gameplay. Now, I really hope you guys enjoyed this content. As always, hashtag game for the sake of gaming, and I will see you guys on the flip side. And please consider subscribing. Still trying to hit that 1,000 goal, and we're inching closer to it, but I would really appreciate it if you guys could help me get there. Take care.